back at CLSP, and I'm going to be talking about prepositions and semantics in computational semantics, and I'm particularly excited to be talking about that here because of all the related topics that are going on in semantic representation, in machine translation and multilinguality, and so forth. So a couple of technical points. Please feel free to interrupt me with questions during the talk. I will try to keep it to about 45 minutes. I'm told there will be an alarm at 1 p.m., so do not be alarmed by the alarm. And I will go ahead and get started. So this talk is about preposition semantics. As a poster pig for preposition semantics, we have Wilbur here, who has this sign saying he will work as food. And the caption says, due to his grammar mistake, Wilbur found a position, it just wasn't the one he wanted. So the point here is that the choice of preposition, that doesn't work, sorry. The choice of the preposition as is really semantically important and changes the whole meaning of the sentence. And so we're going to look at trying to characterize linguistically and then eventually automatically the semantic contributions of prepositions. Before I get started with that, though, a brief recruitment message. This is Georgetown University. If any of you are soon thinking of applying to grad school, I would love for you to apply to either the computer science department or the linguistics department. They have sort of complementary strengths, and please ask me about that if you're interested. Okay, so to bring you up to speed on terminology, there is this term adposition, which is a cover term for prepositions and postpositions. So English has prepositions, which means they precede the noun phrase. And other languages you may have studied, like French, also have prepositions. But some other languages, like Korean and Hindi, Urdu, have postpositions. It just means the order of the marker is reversed relative to the noun phrase. And here is a map from the World Atlas of Linguistic Structures on which languages have prepositions, which are the red languages, and which ones are postpositional, which are the blue languages. You can see they sort of geographically cluster. Most European languages are prepositional. Okay, so for those of you who have studied some syntactic parsing, you know that prepositional phrases are a big challenge. The attachment of prepositional phrases is often highly ambiguous. So if I said I was giving a talk at the workshop on prepositions, this prepositional phrase on prepositions, it could either attach to the talk, meaning that the talk was on prepositions, or it could attach to the workshop, which means the workshop as a whole is devoted to prepositions. So in this talk, I'm not going to be talking about the syntax. I'm going to assume we already have something that has told us about the morphology and syntax, and we're going to be analyzing the semantics. So beyond linking a governor such as workshop, so if it attaches to workshop, we're going to call that the governor, and this is the word prepositions is the object or modifier. Beyond syntactically connecting them, what is it contributing to the sentence? Okay, so if I go to a computational linguistics conference and say that I study preposition semantics, I get a couple of different responses. So the first kind of response typically comes from computer scientists, and it's sort of puzzlement. Like, what do you mean prepositions have semantics? I thought those were the stop words that we throw out when we're trying to get the meaning of a text. But as I will show you, the prepositions actually can be quite important for meaning. The other response I get is from linguists or people with linguistic training is more one of pity, because linguists have realized how complicated this category is and how it's intermixed with many different parts of the grammar, the syntax, and how a small number of function words end up doing a lot of work grammatically. But nevertheless, we're going to persist because prepositions can tell us a lot about semantic relations. Whether Wilbur is working as food or working for food makes a big difference. They're also highly frequent. So this is a word cloud based on English frequency. And you see all of the red ones are the prepositions. If we could account for just, say, the top 10 most frequent prepositions and describe their semantic contribution, we would be covering a whole lot of the proportion of tokens in text than we are currently covering now with just, say, analyzing nouns and verbs. So just a few prepositions are extraordinarily frequent in English. Unfortunately, not yet at NLP conferences. And if we could model even just the top 15 prepositions well, it would be a big step forward. However, the challenge is that with great frequency comes great polysemy. So if you take the word like in, it can be a spatial location like in the box. It could be a time like in the afternoon. It could be a mental state or abstract state like in love or in trouble. And it occurs in these sort of fixed expressions like in fact, which is sort of a discourse marker, discourse connective, and then there are all kinds of other usages. Here's an example with for. You can leave for Paris where it marks a destination. You can eat 4 hours where it's a time duration. You can have a gift for somebody and so forth. But these are not just important and interesting in English. They're also important across languages. So there are when a language has a small number of grammatical categories for expressing certain types of relationships, a whole lot of different semantic functions tend to get shoved into each of the categories, and then the groupings of functions are language specific. So just knowing the preposition that would be used in one language is not enough necessarily to translate. So as a cartoon example of this, I have some examples of for and to, and versus the French prepositions pour, pendant, and à. And unfortunately for machine translation, the translation mappings are not one-to-one. So we have, a gift for somebody would translate, I'm told, as pour, whereas for marking a duration would be pendant. So prepositions are not just interesting for syntax. They're also, maybe if we could characterize the semantics better, it would help us with PP attachment ambiguity, but also interpreting the entire meaning of the sentence in something like semantic role labeling, semantic parsing, understanding. Second language acquisition. If you've ever studied a second language, you've probably struggled to some extent with prepositions. This was a sign I saw in Korea where it says, at a Starbucks in Korea, where it says seat available on upstairs. And, you can understand that perfectly fine, but it's just not the way that a native speaker, it's not the word a native speaker would use. So if you want text that is fully fluent, you have to pay attention to subtle aspects of preposition choice. And finally, machine translation, as I alluded to. So not only in that toy example is it difficult to translate, but there have been some studies of MT output, system output, and looking at the different types of grammatical errors that the systems make. And prepositions are sort of the most frequent closed class word level error that comes out of MT systems. And getting the preposition right can even have socio-political importance. So there was a bit of a brouhaha when there was this sign made for Hispanics para Trump, where it actually should have been a different preposition in Spanish. And there was this fascinating tweet from Ari Fleischer where he said that he was told that he had to refer to the government on Taiwan rather than the government of Taiwan, because the latter had an implication of some sort of legitimacy. So getting the preposition right can actually matter, even if you can understand what was intended. Okay, so one challenge with these prepositions is, or one characteristic is that sometimes you can use different prepositions for the same purpose. So you can say they ran to the roof for a quick escape, or they made for the roof to escape. And the functions of to and for are basically swapped between these two sentences. So the basic goal of the work described in this talk is to come up with labels that can be used to disambiguate the token. And these labels are going to cut across particular lexical items. So destination is going to be the label for the first in both sentences, and purpose is going to be the label for the second. So these labels are reminiscent of thematic roles, if you're familiar with that literature. But the challenge is to come up with a set of them that can actually be applied at a larger scale to annotate corpora, and not just explain our toy linguistic examples. Okay, so the idea, if we had these semantic labels, we would perhaps be able to take our for and to and divide up, characterize the mappings at a finer grain level, and therefore do a better job of translating, for example. Okay, so the two big challenges in this work are, first of all, coverage. So coming up with, due to all this polysemy and as well as rare senses of each of these prepositions, how can we come up with a manageable scheme that is still flexible and robust enough to apply to all the tokens of English? And then the second part is about looking at other languages. So I'm going to say a little bit, not in a whole lot of detail, but what kinds of problems we encounter when we try to take our English labels and apply them to other languages. This work has been published at the Linguistic Workshop for the past couple years, and there's more that's in progress. Okay, so first, English coverage. I have had the pleasure of working with a bunch of fantastic collaborators for almost 3 years, actually. So Vivek Srikumar at the University of Utah, Jena Hwang now at IHMC in Florida, and Martha Palmer and her group at Colorado. And so these people are experts at semantic annotation, and Vivek actually had a paper a few years ago about prepositions that we decided to collaborate and build on that. So the general approach is that of choosing a label. There are two kinds of labels you can use in lexical semantics. One is to take a dictionary definition approach. So in the classical word sense disambiguation approach, you take a particular word and then you look at all the different ways it can be used and write definitions for those, and then you disambiguate into specific senses. This captures some of the fine-grained meaning details that may be truly specific to that word, but it makes it difficult to generalize, particularly to other languages, because you would need to create an entirely new dictionary. But also, if you have a scheme, there have been some schemes that were developed for, say, the top 15 most frequent prepositions, but then if you want to look at 30 more prepositions in English, you would need to define a bunch more definitions. So we're instead taking the supersense approach, which is the idea that our semantic labels are going to be coarser grained, and they're going to apply across particular lexical items, and they're going to have interpretable names like topics. So our human annotators can remember them, and anyone who wants to use our data can sort of see whether it's getting the label correct or not. A similar thing has been done for German. A couple years ago, unfortunately, we were unable to get the data from them, but this is not a brand new idea. Okay, so I showed you a destination and purpose example before. This shows how the several different prepositions are grouped together at a coarse level of granularity. So the first sentence, these would all be location, and this is not to say that all of these are interchangeable. So you would not say we met at we met by Paris, or we met on a shop. So these are not interchangeable, but they have some common core meaning, which is that they mark physical locations. And likewise, these in the second sentence mark times. So those are two of our fairly straightforward labels, location and time. So we have applied so we developed an inventory of these labels. The main contribution is that we have created the first comprehensively annotated corpus of preposition semantics. So in contrast to some of the prior corpus work on preposition semantics for English, we did not hand select certain sentences as examples. We did not only annotate the most frequent prepositions or or something like that. We took an existing corpus that had already had some annotations, and we just went through every sentence by sentence, annotated every single preposition. I'll say a little bit more about that later. So this slide, I don't think I should spend time going through this, but this is to show some of the previous work on preposition semantics for English. And there have been sort of different aims and strategies used in that work, but we're the first that is fully comprehensive on our corpus. However, applying annotation in this way is difficult. So one thing that is challenging is figuring out what should count as a preposition that gets one of these labels. There are multi-word expressions. There are special grammatical uses of these words. Once we set up guidelines for that, then the main effort was deciding what the categories should be, the semantic labels, and exactly how to apply them, and documenting lots of examples of that. But first, I'll just give some examples of why the concept of preposition is a little bit more difficult than it might sound on the surface. So you have these multi-word expressions like in front of, which sort of function together as if they were a single word semantically, as well as due to, and there are others. You have some proper names or idioms that contain a preposition in them, so like the city Newcastle upon Tyne. So for these kinds of multi-word expressions, we just don't even annotate the preposition. We say that it's part of some noun unit or some verb unit, and it will get a semantic label based on the noun or verb. We also have these prepositional phrase multi-word expressions like of course, which doesn't necessarily function as a whole as a preposition, but it's headed syntactically by a preposition. So the canonical construction of a prepositional phrase in English is a preposition followed by a noun phrase, but there are some syntactically weird words that sort of fit in the same category, and depending on whose definition you like, you might call it a preposition. So there's the word ago, which actually follows the noun phrase that is obligatory. There's intransitive words like around, like toss the ball around. So it doesn't have a noun phrase after it, but it has sort of a spatial meaning in a similar sense of walk around the park, and or something like that. Bring down the bed. So there it's a particle and a verb particle construction. We are fairly inclusive, and we say that if anything that can be followed by a noun, any word type that can be followed by a noun phrase, we're basically going to annotate as a potential preposition. Yes? Yes, that's an important. Yes, no, that's an important point. The question is whether the meaning is idiomatic. So with hold up the bank, it's not up in the spatial sense. You just have to know that hold up means a certain action. Bring down the bed is presumably just a spatial, like down the stairs or something. So if it's being used in a totally spatial or temporal way that is not specific to the word bring, then we annotate it semantically. But if it's specific to a particular verb, then we don't. Yeah, so this corpus was already annotated for multi-word expressions. So this should have been done already, but occasionally our annotators saw something that should have been a multi-word expression or whatever. Yeah.
And you wouldn't have any difference between rein in the horse and rein the horse in. In both cases, a particle or a preposition, and that distinction is made by the annotator.
Right. So rein the horse in.
I don't know whether that's spatial or not.
Is that spatial or not?
No,
it's borderline. Yeah. If it's literally about the horse, then we probably would count it spatially. And yeah, there's no difference depending on whether it's immediately after the verb or whether it's after the noun phrase.
But in neither case is horse the object of that preposition.
No, it's not the object. So we consider it as an intransitive preposition. Yeah. There's also some overlap in the words that can be prepositions versus the words that can be subordinators. It's sometimes called subordinating conjunctions. And we are inclusive, and so for a word like before, whether you say before making the gaff or before the gaff, it's really conveying the same sort of meaning, so we just annotate it as a time. And then there are these weird syntactic constructions like with marking absolute clauses and all this stuff, and we had to develop conventions for these. Okay, so the more difficult aspect then was defining actually a set of categories. So we started with a set of 32 categories from the previous work, Vivek Srikumar, that I mentioned. And we also looked at the VerbNet roles, which are of a similar flavor, but only applied to core arguments of verbs. So they did not have appropriate roles for, say, relations between two nominals in many cases. We did a whole lot of iterative, discussion or, hypothesizing categories and refining them based on examples and pilot annotation. We ended up allowing multiple, so we ended up developing a hierarchy, so not just a list, but a hierarchy to allow for some finer grained things, as well as multiple inheritance. So in the case of this via category, it's actually a combination of instrument and path. So if you talk to someone over Skype, it's sort of it includes mediums of communication, and we say that it inherits, some instrument meaning and some path meaning. So here is our version 1.0 of our hierarchy that we use to annotate the data. You can see it's rather complex. So the way to read this is that the circled ovals, the ovals are the top level categories, and then the subcategories radiate outwards. So circumstance has a subtype which is place, which has a subtype which is locus, which includes source and materials. Yeah.
This hierarchy would actually include all the categories, not necessarily just
basically because we only developed it for prepositions, but because English prepositions are so important to the grammar, we haven't really found any thematic roles that we think are not covered by this. Yeah. There are some discourse relations that maybe are not covered by this, but thematic roles, yeah. So we ended up with 75 categories that we decided to annotate with. This is quite a lot. So, what?
Meant to be cross-linguistic.
We haven't got to the cross-linguistic part yet. This is for English. We came up with 75 categories. This is quite a lot. So if you imagine trying to train an annotator, trying to remember all of the 75 categories in your head is probably not going to be easy to do, especially with rare idiosyncratic constructions. So what we did was we documented these examples of prepositions used in these categories in a resource at that link. To zoom in on the hierarchy a bit, you can see that there's a very general temporal class which refines into sort of duration versus time versus frequency, and time gets refined into relative times. So things like before and after, and that gets refined into start time and end time, like from and to, and so forth. Here are examples for these different categories, but I'm not going to spend time on that right now. Yes, so because there are so many of these categories and so many prepositions to worry about, we needed to create a lexical resource to help people out. So we created a wiki. This is called PrepWiki. It has entries based on a previous resource, the Preposition Project Lexicon, and examples from that resource as well as that we added. And the examples are labeled with the supersense categories. So I guess I have animation of this. So the important thing to know is if you see a sentence, a use of in, there will be a drop-down box for the categories that are documented within, and then the annotator would choose something that is the sentence that is most similar as a guide, basically. So using this process, we've annotated an online reviews corpus, which we've called Streusel. So this is the reviews portion of the English web tree bank. And we had previously annotated it for multi-word expressions and for noun and verb supersenses. So there are semantic classes on the nouns and verbs. That was basically irrelevant for this task because we didn't we just did that separately. Again, this was the first data set with all the preposition types and tokens semantically annotated, and all of our sentences were double annotated and adjudicated. Because this is such a hard task, we wanted to make sure that at least 2 people were looking at every sentence. And the lexical resource provided support, but it didn't constrain the annotator. So if they thought there was a usage that wasn't covered in the wiki, they were allowed to use any of the labels. Our annotators were students at CU Boulder. They had, I think, in all cases, done some sort of semantic annotation before, but they were not PhDs in linguistics. So they were trained for this task by people at Boulder mostly, and we measured inter-annotator agreement. It varied a lot depending on the pair of annotators, but in the sort of 60 to 70s range. But then we had an expert go through and correct every instance of a disagreement between the original annotators. And the inter-annotator agreement between the experts is pretty good, something like 88%. Still, so this is a very challenging annotation task, but we feel like there is more signal than there is noise, let's say. We saw a whole lot of preposition types in our corpus. This is a sample of the single word ones, and then the multi-word ones, things like rather than, along with, as soon as, all got annotated as prepositions. We ended up with 4,250 tokens that got a semantic label. There were a few that were excluded as being a discourse connective or something else, but there were over 4,000 that got a semantic label. I want you to guess, does anyone want to guess what proportion of the tokens were one of the top 10 most frequent prepositions? So if you think back to the word cloud, there were a few really frequent prepositions. What percentage of all the tokens were in the top 10 prepositions? You think 40, 60? Anyone think higher than 60? What? 80? Okay. So here's the result, and it ended up being about 75%. So if you look at just 2 of, in, and for, that's 50%. And then you add a few more, it's about 75%. What? Price is Right rules. I didn't tell you what the rules were, so the wheel of fortune, more like. So this is a highly Zipfian distribution. This is what makes this so challenging. However, if you look at the distribution of semantic labels, it's a lot more even. So we have a few that dominate, like location and purpose and time. But there are, most of our semantic labels had, we had 75 labels, and most of them had some representation in the corpus.
So I was right about the right.
What?
That one's about 40.
That one's about 40, yeah. Okay. Another thing that we thought was interesting was that the distribution of spatial versus temporal versus other. So if you look at the linguistics literature about prepositions, there's a whole lot of focus on space and time, which are important domains in language. But the spatial and temporal prepositions are only about a third in our corpus. Now, maybe genre is a factor, but if we only had space and time annotations, there would be a ton that we were missing. If you sort of exclude of, which is sort of somewhat different grammatically, fully 50% are a semantic use of a preposition that's neither spatial nor temporal. We also, if you're interested, did an analysis on how our annotations relate to prop bank, because the corpus had been independently annotated with prop bank, and basically we see a big difference between prop bank core roles and prop bank modifier, sort of adjunct roles. So the adjunct roles are the ones on the right, and they have for the most part, are pretty clean in mapping to certain supersenses in our scheme, but the core roles are all over the place, and we think that this may be in part due to the way in which they assigned these function labels to their core roles, and maybe that needs to be revisited on the prop bank side. Okay, so that covers what I had to say about English specifically for the corpus that we've created. Any questions about that? Okay, so now I will move on to the multilingual side of things. So we started calling this project Carmel. We needed a name for our project, and we decided to call it Carmels for case and adposition representation and multilingual semantics. So we're looking at adpositions in across languages as well as case markers because they overlap a lot in semantic function. And again, I'm still working with these fantastic collaborators. We also brought in, so the people on the sort of principal people on the team had a little bit of expertise with these languages, and so we brought on people who are experts and native speakers of these languages to help us out. So these are our three focus languages: Hindi, Korean, and Hebrew for the time being. And we've started looking at some parallel data and as well as non-parallel data, and how can we annotate using our labels. So as before, each language presents different challenges in defining the phenomena of interest. So what counts as an adposition or a case marker that has a semantic label? Morphology, of course, is a much bigger deal in most languages. And we're sort of assuming we have some sort of morphological analysis to start with that tells us, what things are adpositions or case markers. Again, multi-word expressions or multi-morpheme expressions, and of course deciding which supersense to use and whether there's any supersense from our English-based hierarchy that works. These are some technical details for those of you who are interested in morphology. You can ask me to come back to them. So here's an example from Hebrew. This is from the Hebrew translation of The Little Prince. And here's the English translation of The Little Prince from this website. And there are some interesting correspondences here. I just want to point to one or two of them. So for the most part, the Hebrew prepositions match up pretty cleanly to English ones. But there are a few interesting ones. So in English, it says, on making his discovery, the astronomer had presented it to the International Astronomical Congress. In the Hebrew, it says, after he made his discovery. So this is a case where it's really presenting the same information, but it's portraying it in a slightly different way. One is as a temporal relationship, and one is sort of at the same time versus after, I guess, is how I would characterize it. Another thing that comes up is that adpositions can be used in certain special constructions, like the possessive construction in Hebrew. So the normal way you say you have, they don't have a verb like have. Instead, you would say something like there is to me. And therefore, we have to decide whether we annotate that as a real preposition or whether we just say that's just a special grammatical thing. Here's a sentence from Hindi. I'm not a Hindi speaker, but the interesting thing in this sentence was this marker ke chalte, which doesn't seem to have a clear correspondence to an English preposition. It sort of means after the start of, but overlapping in time with. So it's sort of like during, but during and after the start of. So we're a little bit unsure what to do with that. Maybe one of our temporal labels is good enough, or maybe we would have to really refine our inventory of labels to really capture it. Because we're being coarse-grained, we can probably get away with what we have. Here's one where we decided we really do need new labels. This is Korean. There's this postposition that there are postpositions that function like conjunctions. So where in English we would say coffee or tea, in Korean the first noun is marked with a postposition. And there's really no semantic label in English that corresponds to a simple conjunction. So, yeah. This is where I can't really answer because I'm not, but grammatically, morphologically, they pattern like postpositions in Korean, and they may also have other senses which are. Okay, maybe not in Japanese. I'm not. So this is the disclaimer. If anyone here is a Korean linguist, okay. Do you think of these as postpositions? Yeah, I mean it could be a terminology issue, but I would rather be more inclusive than exclude something, and then people say, well, I really wanted you to tag this. So we've concluded that this is semantic territory that we need to add new labels for. So this brings us to sort of a status update very briefly. So looking at other languages and also revisiting our English annotations, because once you apply an annotation scheme, you then have a whole bunch of things that you wish you had done differently. And so we revisited some of the labels we didn't really like, and we realized that one of the challenges was that we were making this assumption that the preposition marks a semantic role, basically, in some scene, usually marked by the predicate. So I thought about getting my ears pierced. We can say that thought is a verb that is a cognitive verb, so it has a thinker, and it has the thing you're thinking about, which we would call the topic, and about conveniently is available to mark topics. So this is one of the main functions of about in English is to mark topics. Great, but it's not always so simple. So we had verbs of emotion, which we would normally think of as having an experiencer and a stimulus role. But they can also be used with about. So the way we think about this now is that there's sort of a compatible but not quite identical semantics to these two words. We say that scared sort of suggests a stimulus, but about suggests a topic still. So there's some sort of way in which a topic can be compatible with conveying a stimulus, the thing you're scared about. or the thing that is scaring you. It's really, they're basically the same thing, underlyingly. But there is some sort of, different nuance of meaning. There's sort of a different perspective, maybe, that is suggested by the preposition. And once we started, looking for these, we found them all over the place, where, so it turns out that stimulus can be expressed with different prepositions, like by, which sort of suggests more of a causer. So it's like as if the bear is responsible for scaring you versus just the thing you have some fear about. So we have several, so we've been annotating both, in these cases, what we call the scene role, which is what is suggested by the predicate, and the preposition function, which is the semantics of the preposition lexically itself. And this really helps us adapt to phenomena in other languages that were sort of like there was this tension between two of our labels. So one of these is with experiencer datives. So in English, you have to occasionally can mark an experiencer, like the bear felt scary to me or seemed to me. Me is really an experiencer, but to really suggests a recipient, something like you're receiving the emotion or something like that. And this is actually the standard way to talk about emotions and bodily experiences in many languages. So Hebrew, you would literally say, hurts to me the head, to say my head hurts. And in Korean, you would use this dative marker ko on I, on the pronoun I, to mark that it is the experiencer. But there's still the native speakers say that there is still a semantics of some sort of recipientness that's in there. So our tentative solution is now to allow tokens to receive two labels when it's warranted. These labels are both from the hierarchy, so it's not like we have two different hierarchies. We have one hierarchy, but we try to handle these overlap phenomena instead of using multiple inheritance, which created a whole lot of very fine-grained categories before. We think we can capture a lot of this by marking two labels on the token. It also solves these vexing problems like location as destination coercion. So the verb put, you put something at a place, you can basically use any locative preposition there, as well as so you have the preposition to, which suggests a destination. But you can use any preposition that would normally just be a single location. So put it under the table, put it on the table, put it next to the table, etc. And our annotators were having trouble knowing whether to use destination as the label there or just location. This solution tells us, well, you should use destination for the role suggested by the verb put, but location suggested by the preposition itself. There's also this phenomenon called fictive motion, where a static scene is depicted or expressed as if it's moving. So with a metaphor, so the road runs through the forest. The road is not actually moving, but you can follow with your eyes the road as it goes through the forest. And so here we would say that the role suggested by runs is, the role suggested by the scene itself is more static, but the role suggested by the choice of verb and the choice of preposition is more dynamic. It's more of a path. So if you recall, this was our original hierarchy. If we use this construal analysis and taking into account some of the phenomena in other languages, we think we can reduce it from 75 categories down to 50 categories without any multiple inheritance. So this is we're almost ready to sign off on this as the hierarchy, and we will then start re-annotating our data a lot of the changes are just sort of collapsing fine-grained distinctions. So that will be fairly easy. But there are some things that we really didn't like how we were doing them before. I'm basically out of time. So I just want to mention that this corpus resource will open us up to data science questions like, is this a good annotation scheme for these other languages? Is this cost effective? What's the best process for annotating? Linguistic questions like, which labels are expressed with adpositions in which languages, and in particular, which construals are available for which languages. Maybe things like looking at relationship to other analyses. And then for NLP, of course, we want to have a way to disambiguate these in context. There's already been, there was a paper at Coling, I believe, on using the first version of our data set. We want to do this once we finalize the second version of the data set, and look at other problems like predicting the preposition from the supersense, or plugging it into applications. So with that, I will summarize that I believe that adpositions and case markers are really important for NLP and semantics, and it's really linguistically challenging as well as procedurally challenging. There are many different facets of meaning that you could try to focus on. We've focused on the sort of thematic role dimension. There's a long way to go before we'll have covered even a handful of the many languages in the world. So we want lots of help in doing that. And hopefully, eventually, we'll be able to say we have solved, or at least made headway on preposition semantics. And with that, I will thank all of you for listening and all of my collaborators, and that is my website. More questions? Yes.
So you've got the corpus.
Yes.
And obviously there was some interesting modeling and prediction problems.
Yes.
You're probably thinking about this?
Yes. So our intention was to start building classification and models once we had the corpus, and then we realized that there were a whole lot of things we didn't like about the annotations. There were, in particular, there was sort of I showed you the pie chart of labels. There were some labels that were really, really rare and had almost no tokens in our corpus. So do we want to really do a 75-way classification task with some incredibly rare labels? It's never going to get those right. So we started down that road, and then we thought, we should probably push for a better corpus before we try to spend too much time on modeling. I'm hoping that it will not be more than a couple months for us to convert the old corpus into the new corpus once we finalize the new one.
But can you say something about what kinds of things you want to do? So it sounds like you're predicting the annotator's annotation from the word, but there are other questions that you might want to ask.
Yeah, so that's disambiguation.
Construction, lexicalize the preposition is in rather than of or something.
Yeah, we can look at the relationship to different constructions, the relationship to verbs that select specific prepositions. So there's idiomaticity. We also want to look at predicting the adposition from the semantic label. So this gets into some finer grained aspects of meaning than we're capturing now. So how much additional meaning would you have to know to say that the seating is on the third floor rather than in the third floor or whatever?
That might be construction. We talk for reasons that are specific to English about inverse sum. It could have gone either way in the evolution of English.
Yeah. So some of the
it got frozen.
Yes. So some of this is exactly. So trying to figure out which what syntactic environment or what lexical environment is influences the choice of preposition would certainly be. And like for times, you know that Clock times, you would say at, so at 5 o'clock. But days of the week, you would say on Thursday, over the weekend, So there are certain sort of semantic classes that are finer grained that influence the choice of preposition. Yeah. I think you are next. The main criterion was whether the preposition was adding sort of a compositional, spatial, or temporal meaning. So something like brought the bed down. What? Yes. So I have another talk that I could give you sometime about annotating multi-word expressions. And so there are a lot of challenging border cases, but we found that annotators can more or less reliably distinguish the multi-word expressions that are somehow idiomatic from the ones that are more or less compositional. Yeah. Yeah.
So in the 2.0 version of the guidelines, you settled on allowing the verb to sort of assign a role to the stimulus, and then the preposition would assign another role. And it seemed like, at least in the examples you gave, that the preposition was sort of assigning a refinement of the verb's role. And I'm trying to tease apart this versus the multiple inheritance.
Yeah.
Versus a hierarchical structure.
Yeah, so, normally we wouldn't say that a prototypical use of topic is with something like about, thought about, or, this is a book about politics. And we wouldn't really say that, in a book about politics, there's not really a stimulus.
So you wouldn't say that about just topics in general, but you could say that this topic is a refinement. Like it's a stimulus.
Yeah. So the way we had been handling, I think not this case, but some similar sort of overlap cases in the past was we had the multiple inheritance and we had a finer grain. But this created a whole lot of low-level categories that were difficult to work with.
Like double inheritance. Is it just like is it just multiple inheritance, but max 2 and exactly 2?
I think the claim that we would make is that these phenomena are pretty productive across and different across different languages. So if you were to look at another language, maybe a normally topic marking preposition would not work for a stimulus. You would have to use something else, like an ablative marker or something. Some of the refined multiple inheritance categories we had for English, it turned out weren't enough to cover some of these overlapping things in other languages. So we're hoping that separating the two out will be a way forward. Yeah.
There's one over.
Maybe you just briefly specifically talks about what you meant by you had that pie chart with rare categories.
Yeah.
And you say, well, it seems like some of these categories are rare and we don't like that.
Yeah, and they were rare because every preposition has some really specific constructions, like something we didn't even have a category for that is really specific is on marking a medicine, like on drugs. You can substitute any name of a drug pretty much. That it's hard to see how that generalizes to one of these other labels. I think we chose a very general one like state or something. But that's not to say that you could substitute that there are other prepositions in English that can mark drugs in the same way. An example of one that we had. So we got too fine-grained on the path prepositions. We had one that was called contour, which was like describing the shape of a path. So like driving in a circle. So I think it was just in, or maybe a couple of others, for describing the shape of a path, and that inherited from path as well as location or something like that. We just found that in practice, training annotators to remember what that was difficult. Applying it to exactly, and then annotating a data set where it has very few tokens, it doesn't look like it's going to be useful anyway, because you can't train a classifier on that specific thing. But what we can do is lump it in with a bigger label, but we still have the preposition itself to suggest that maybe if in is marked as a path, that it has this special meaning, So we could have lexical information that would enhance the supersenses. Yeah?
I would imagine that a lot of usage of Corner are sort of metaphorical extensions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how would you label them this falls under the category of that was basically?
Yeah, this falls under the category of X. The annotators have a little bit of flexibility to decide whether to annotate the source domain of the metaphor or the target domain of the metaphor. For something like it falls under, I would probably go with the target, try to capture the target domain. Let me actually, so after this, I can actually look up in the wiki and see if we have an example for that. But I would call it something vague like state, probably. Actually, in the new version of the hierarchy, we've collapsed the spatial versus abstract locations. So that makes it easier. We would just call it, so we have this term locus, which sort of covers metaphorical as well as concrete places. And we would probably use that. Or we would maybe call it a co-theme or theme or something with respect to the verb, but there's a slippery slope. Yeah. Well, yeah, you can think of, I do think of these as prototype categories, and something like the proto-roles could be a way to decompose these categories. Yeah. Yeah. But it is nice to have, I personally like to have semantic role labels with names that I can sort of remember how it groups with other things. Whether or not this is a, clearly defined category with clear boundaries, or whether it's just sort of a fuzzy category with clear prototypes. I like having a name that I can associate with it. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank the speaker.